Okay. Hello, and thank you for joining us for the Amherstburg Freedom Museum's Black History Series presentation titled On Account of Darkness, Shining Light on Race and Sport. Today's guest speaker is Ian Kennedy, a resident of Erie Beach, Ontario. Ian Kennedy is an educator and journalist with a passion for storytelling. The founder of the Chatham-Kent Sports Network, Ian is currently a writer for the Hockey News and Yahoo Sports. His stories have also appeared in the Globe and Mail, Chatham Voice, Outdoor Canada, NHL.com, and Canadian Horse Journal. Ian's debut book, On Account of Darkness, Shining Light on Race and Sport, published by British Columbia's Tidewater Press, is now available for purchase. I've already shared the link to the book in the chat section, and we also have copies at the Amherstburg Freedom Museum in our gift shop as well, if you'd like to purchase it there. During the presentation, if everyone could please mute your microphone while Ian is speaking, that would be appreciated. Following the presentation, there will also be a Q&A, so you can write your questions in the comment section, or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. And so let's pass it over to Ian, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me here. I'm excited to speak to you all about this topic and about my book, but I'm going to jump right into it. So on the screen, you can see a few of the characters that, and I call them characters because they seem like that to me, but I know they're real people. We've got Fergie Jenkins, Wilfred Boomer Harding, and Ian Jacobs. But I'm going to start with answering a question, and if you can see my picture or my face in any of these things, I think there's a very important question to be answered about who I am. And that question that I want to answer is, why is a white person discussing racism? And I think that if I don't address that first and foremost, I'd be remiss. First of all, I want to let you know that I have approached this book project and all of my research as a preservationist, not necessarily as a storyteller, even though I love telling stories. But I saw a group of stories and the histories of families and people that were disappearing that I'd never heard before, even though I'd been writing about sports for more than a decade. And that didn't feel right to me. It was, um, it was a sad thing to see those stories go untold. So I approached it as a preservationist, and I want to let you know that I'm here to hold space to hopefully not be the person in the future that's doing this. But I was also part of it. I was raised not so much by my family, but in my community, steeped in racism, whether it was anti-Black racism or anti-Indigenous racism. And that's why, if you read my book, you'll see that I've placed myself in many of the stories because I was there, I was part of it, and hopefully I can be a part of the anti-oppressive education that this book aims to tackle. I'm going to start with anti-Black racism and move through some of the different sections in the book that I would talk about in general. So the picture there is from the Colored Hockey League of the Maritimes. And I think that the history of our sport in Canada, we kind of pretend that we're this all-inclusive, all-welcoming country, and we gloss over a lot of the actual facts in the history. Hockey in general, as one of the main sports, we talk about it as if it was rooted in whiteness, as if it was created and only played by white people. And of course, that's false. And this league in particular is a wonderful example of that, being founded in 1895, only 2 years after the Stanley Cup was founded. And the NHL itself was not founded until 1917. So if we look at the history, it speaks more clearly than what we've been portraying recently. This league itself is where the slap shot was created, and it's where the first goaltender dropped to their knees to make a save. Two foundational things if you watch the Stanley Cup playoffs right now. But looking at how sport plays into this, because that's the topic that really I've been writing about and speaking on. Sport is not just games. I've been told to stick to sports my entire life in my writing, and there's far more to it than that. Sports are a tool or a mechanism to uphold oppressive systems, to uphold whiteness and a hierarchy among people. And of course, that's not what we want them to be. And one of the ways that that was originally done was through segregation. Pictured here, you can see the Chatham Colored All-Stars, and you can also see in the top left-hand corner there, Wilfred Boomer Harding is a member of the Windsor Stafford baseball team. So they are, the All-Stars have been spoken about so much, this team that in 1934 became the first ever all-black baseball team to win a provincial championship in Canada. An amazing history. The team was founded in 1932, but of course there were no leagues at that point for them to participate in. So they began by barnstorming across Ontario, and at every stop they were met with spit, rocks, stones.
Yeah, try that.
They were parents encouraged their kids to hurl those racial slurs at the team. And if they did win, they often had to fight their way out of whatever town they were in and off the field. The year that they were entered into the playoffs for the first time, a man by the name of Archie Sterling actually removed the name colored from their team moniker to try and fool or trick the governing bodies or the other teams so that they wouldn't know that this was a team of all black baseball players coming to play. And the name of my book, On Account of Darkness, actually stems from that year in 1934, when the All-Stars are on the verge of winning that provincial championship. The game was called On Account of Darkness, the championship game, when they're winning 3-2 at 4:30 in the afternoon in broad daylight. And of course, the members of that team and their descendants now will clearly tell you that the only reason it was too dark on the field was because there was 9 black baseball players. And that history has repeated itself throughout sport. The idea that sports are away from society and away from the cultural issues that we face is completely false. And two of the main spots where that happened is in arenas and pools, which of course remain segregated for decades after most other things ended. Wilfred Boomer Harding himself in the 1940s tried to go skating with his family at Detroit's Olympia Stadium. That was the home of the Detroit Red Wings for about 50 years. And right at the verge of the ice, he was turned away. And the arena attendant told him that public skating meant whites only. Boomer Harding, 2 years later, would become the first black man to ever skate at Detroit's Olympia Stadium as a member of the Windsor Staffords. But his story of being the first in hockey doesn't end there, because that team that he was playing for was in a league called the International Hockey League, which was a feeder system to the Detroit Red Wings, his team that he was playing on. And he was also the first black man to play in that league. 12 years before Willie O'Ree broke the color barrier in the NHL as the first black man to skate in that league. But Boomer Harding, even on his own team, couldn't catch a break. They had a team rule that the owner would buy a fedora, a fancy hat, to any player on the team that scored a hat trick. And so Boomer, in his first couple of games, went out and scored twice. And then he found himself sitting on the bench and wouldn't get another shift in the game. A couple games later, he'd score twice. And he found himself again stuck on the bench. So even within his own team, a team that had allowed him to break a barrier within that league, he wasn't going to get the same opportunity as any other player. So Boomer would go about by passing the puck every time he got the chance for the first 2 periods, and he wouldn't actually attempt to score until the third, because then he knew if he was going to get benched, at least he wouldn't miss the entire game. So his story is quite inspirational, I think, in terms of the fact that he was a member of the 1934 Colored All-Stars, and he broke another barrier in hockey. Quite a monumental feat for someone that couldn't eat in a restaurant on the main street of the town where the Chatham baseball team was paraded down after their championship. And another member of that team was of the Chatham Colored All-Stars over their 9-year run was Ferguson Jenkins Sr. And you saw Fergie there in the opening slide. And I just want to read you a really quick excerpt from my book in a chapter called A Parade for Fergie, because I want to let you know again that I'm placed here, and I want you to realize that, of course, as I'm sure you do, that racism is here in Canada, white supremacy is here in Canada, and is all tied to sport, whether or not we want it to be. So here's just a couple of sentences from the introduction of a chapter called A Parade for Fergie. For years, I would follow the same truck on my way to work. The driver and I likely woke at the same time, checked the same weather reports. Maybe we sat down at similar tables and drank our coffee, and then stood together to gather our coats and shoes. The darkest hours seemed to be those just prior to sunrise, my turn signal illuminating the world in intervals. As I pulled onto the highway, the man in his truck would pull out ahead of me like clockwork. I could see his eyes in the glow of my headlights on his rearview mirror. There in the darkness, on the road in front of me, he'd accelerate. My beams would strike his tailgate and bring to life the Confederate flag painted there. Each morning, I wondered about that man. We were in Canada, after all. This flag had no geographic origin here, but it did have meaning. Eventually, the driver of the truck would pass a sign reading, "Welcome to Chatham, home of Fergie Jenkins." In the book, I go on to talk about other stories, not related to the Chatham Colored All-Stars, of course, that have to do with Black history, Indigenous history, and the history of Asian Canadians, but how sport was used to uphold some of these systems of anti-Black racism. So the first one there, cricket. Cricket has been a sport that we don't talk about much in Canada, but at one point this was the main sport played in Canada. As Canada was being settled and colonized, it was the most popular sport, and Chatham was fantastic. We sent people to the Team Ontario and the national team repeatedly. But two of the members of Chatham's cricket club, Edwin Larwell and H.A. Tanzer, who, of course, if you are aware at all of local history, were two of the most fervently opposed people to Black settlement and to upholding a racial barrier. So cricket was seen as the superior game. It was for the upper class. And in Chatham, newspapers called baseball the degenerates game. And in 1871, the first ever recorded baseball game was played in Chatham, Ontario, in the city, and it was played by an all-Black baseball team. But men like Larwell and Tanzer fervently fought against Black settlement in terms of Larwell, and Tanzer, of course, was a noted eugenicist and racist. Also, Edwin Larwell was one of the founding members of Chatham's Turf Club, which was for horse racing. And of course, that was also segregated. It was an all-white club. But the first ever recorded incident of a Black person participating in sport in Chatham, Kent, was actually horse racing, albeit done illegally down the main street, and that person was arrested, despite the fact that his white opponent was not. And in terms of the All-Stars themselves, one of the other ways that sport upholded these racist ideas was through a form of minstrel entertainment. And that's what I think of many of the towns, if in research and reading about the Chatham Colored All-Stars, participated in. When they would show up to watch the All-Stars play, it wasn't necessarily to see the baseball. It was for them to throw their racist slurs and their stones and to get out the hatred that they had towards Black athletes. So sport has played a role in this. And of course, through the segregation, and I saw one of our guests here is the man in the middle picture there, Jerry Binga. But there's a variety of stereotypes that come along with sport. And historically, if you look at it, what we don't learn, we don't do. So the fact that swimming pools were segregated, not open to Black people, that public beaches weren't actually public, they were white only, comes along with the stereotype of Black athletes in swimming. And the same goes for hockey. There were no arenas that allowed Black participants locally. So outdoor rinks became the only thing. And then when desegregation occurred, of course, both of these things moved to the suburbs, and then it became a socioeconomic divide. But Jerry there was a fabulous swimmer and a fabulous hockey player, captain of the Blenheim Golden Blades junior hockey team, a championship swimmer, and his family has ties to the Amherstburg area, actually. William Binga being a famous baseball player, and his history and the history of his family play deeply into the book as well. So I was glad to see his name pop up on the screen. And while, of course, the book talks about all of the different facets of oppression and barriers, it also talks about Black excellence and about uh, the resistance that was formed against these barriers. And one of the people that was really intriguing to me was a man named Rollie Miles, who is a CFL Hall of Famer, football player from Edmonton. And Rollie actually ended a sundown town practice, which of course I think we all know is the meaning that whether it was Black, Indigenous, or Asian Canadians were not allowed in town after dark. And this one comes up with a story from my hometown of Wallaceburg, Ontario. And it's been hotly contested over the years whether or not Wallaceburg was actually a sundown town, because as Rollie found out, it wasn't on the books. But in the 1950s, Rollie Miles was invited to come to Wallaceburg and speak to a group of service club members. It was a room of almost entirely white men, and Rollie, being after dinner time, stood up at the podium and said, "I understand that my presence here is against your laws. And I'm not sure if you brought me here just to sign autographs or if you want to talk to Rollie Miles the man." And he said, "I'm going to leave unless you take this off your books." So they looked at the books, found it wasn't there. But of course, um, we can understand that sundown towns were upheld through redlining, realtors not selling properties, banks not giving loans, and through intimidation, which is actually how it happened in Wallaceburg. The sundown town rule there was started after fights broke out between teams from Dresden and Wallaceburg. And every time the Dresden team was in town playing baseball, they would fight and they would get beat. So eventually Dresden started bringing boxers and wrestlers from the Don settlement near Uncle Tom's Cabin. And then Wallaceburg responded by getting a group of shipbuilders. And the rule became that if you were a Black person entering Wallaceburg, you needed to fight a shipbuilder to enter. And hundreds of years later, it was still in operation until Rollie Miles stood up at a microphone. And 2 years later, the Highgate family, a Black family, moved into Wallaceburg for the first time ever. So the book will outline a variety of those things, not just the bad, but showing some of these incredible advocates and activists that used their position in sport to create change. While I understand that, I'm speaking with the Amherstburg Freedom Museum here, the book dives into a variety of different groups of people, and I don't think that we would be able to talk about race or racism in Canada right now without discussing anti-Indigenous racism, because of course, this was a group of people where sport was used directly as a tool or a weapon. And I'm going to read to you again just one more section here from my book about Wallaceburg, Ontario, where I grew up, where anti-Indigenous racism was rampant. This is from a chapter called "It Was Never Our Game." A wave of smoke and stale beer would crawl across you, sticking to your hair and skin as you entered Sam's Hotel in Wallaceburg, marking you. Above the bar, in rented rooms, were drug addicts, the residents who validated the hotel moniker. On the main floor, the thud of music would fill your ears, slightly tinny while simultaneously too much bass. Nameless and hapless bodies rubbed against each other on the dance floor, watched by older men with crude mouths. On the right was a long bar lined with cheap liquor and bargain beer. To the left, there were a few pool tables. A dive bar that was only palatable in an inebriated low light. Sam's was not the kind of place you told your mother about, although she'd probably been there at some point as well. It was where we went when we wanted the darkness to hide us. Sam's Hotel opened in 1947 as the Lord Selkirk Ballroom, named in honor of a man who devised a plan to expropriate nearby Indigenous lands for a Scottish settlement. Before my first visit, I was told to lower my gaze and walk straight through to the back of the club where the tables lined the dance floor near the stage. This is where the white people sat. I was taught not to make eye contact with the people who inhabited the front half of the space. This is where the Indigenous people were. Sam's had a reputation. This was where fights happened, where people got stabbed. I never did see a stabbing, but I saw fights, and I saw someone run down by a car in the parking lot, right next to the No Frills grocery store shopping cart return. And I read headline after headline about assault, attempted murder, and more. As the clock crept past midnight, pores filled with smoke and cells swelled with alcohol, the intolerance held in the fatty parts of our body was released as muscle memory moved opponents from the dance floor to the parking lot. Sometimes it was one person fighting another. Sometimes it was group versus group. Always white versus Indigenous. I'm not sure I ever knew a motive. And it was years before I realized I didn't know how we'd got here, how Canada had got here. Of course, in the book, we look at residential schools, which the history of is really coming to light now. The man in the middle there is a man named Bill Sands, who has become very close to me. And in Canada, we sent 150,000 Indigenous children, some as young as 3 years old, to residential schools. There was a higher death rate in residential schools in Canada than those in active duty in World War II. They created family separation. They allowed for abuse, malnutrition. They took away language. They took away spirituality. They took away traditional haircuts. And I don't want to say students. The children there had to follow strict rules, which is why I put schools in brackets, because these are facilities and institutions, not schools. And of course, we know that they led to generational trauma, including poverty and substance abuse. Bill Sands was taken to the first formed residential school in Canada, Mohawk Institute, nicknamed the Mush Hole for the worm-filled and infested food that was given to kids. His family never knew he was gone. He got on the bus one morning to go to school and was picked up by the agent who took him to Mohawk. The first day he was there, he was beaten multiple times. And every day after that, for the first 2 weeks, he was beaten morning, noon, and night. At Mohawk, he played hockey. He was the goaltender for their hockey team. And every Saturday night, they would sit the boys in a room where they would watch Hockey Night in Canada. Even there, he wasn't free from the fights, though. Today on Walpole Island, Bill Sands is one of the most famous duck hunting guides that's ever stepped foot on the land. And he's taken some of those hockey stars that he used to watch on the television. Gordie Howe, Bobby Orr, Alex Delvecchio have all been there to hunt with him, along with celebrities like Cher and several prime ministers and presidents. But at residential schools, hockey was this tool. We think of hockey in Canada as our game, our national sport. And it's tied to our identity in so many ways, which is why it was introduced at residential schools to make Indigenous youth feel more Canadian, because playing hockey to us makes us Canadian. When children at these residential schools came to love the sport and found it as a sense of respite from the abuse, it was then taken away. It was used as a tool of discipline. And of course, the rules and structure of games, our colonial version of sports, were used to instill that structure. Of course, sport, like the game of lacrosse, was originally used as medicine, a healthy habit. It was a spiritual game. It was a game for social interaction. But we've changed the purposes of those games as well. And lacrosse, being an original Begataway, an Indigenous game, was changed into box lacrosse that we see today to utilize arenas, hockey arenas, in the summertime. Other things that we've done with Indigenous athletes in sport is a man like Fred Sasakamoose attended residential school where he was introduced to hockey and was later called the first Indigenous person to play hockey in the NHL in 1953. Not the case, but by our colonial settler definition, he was. The true answer to that trivia question is a hockey player named Taffy Abel. Taffy passed as white and pretended to be white for the bulk of his life, at least during his hockey playing life. He played in the NHL in 1926. He won 2 Stanley Cups and was the captain of Team USA at the 1924 Olympics, winning a silver medal. However, he knew the racism that he would face if he identified as an Indigenous man. And one of the measures that historically has been used is something called blood quantum. So blood quantum is a measure of how Indigenous a person is. It's been used to restrict funding to Indigenous communities and people, to remove the identification of someone being Indigenous. And it's really, if you think of a more common book nowadays where you see this in literature, we've seen it in something like Harry Potter, where they talk about the half-bloods pitted against the full-bloods and the Muggles. And this is rooted in truth. And one of the local people that I talk about in the book is a man named Ed Penance. Ed Penance from Walpole Island First Nation was the first, quote unquote, and I hate saying these things, a full-blooded Indigenous person to play Major League Baseball when he did so in 1903 for the Philadelphia Athletics. In reality, he was the 4th Indigenous man to play Major League Baseball, but he gets the history because he was the first one recognized by white society as full-blooded. And of course, in our area, we also had a large amount of anti-Asian racism. And this stemmed predominantly in southwestern Ontario during Japanese internment during World War II. But to go back to Penance there before I move on just for 1 second, I do want to mention as well that Ed Penance learned the game of baseball at residential schools. He was sent to Shinglock Residential School. And he later became friends with a very famous American named Henry Ford. Penance actually saved Ford's life and the Penance family as his ship was sinking just off the shores of Walpole Island. And later, Henry Ford was the first person to introduce not only an automobile, but farm equipment to Walpole Island First Nation, causing it, of course, to be the domestication of the land. But Henry Ford himself was also an excessively, extremely racist man, an anti-Semite as well. And one of the things that Henry Ford instituted and tried to get included into school curriculums across North America was square dancing. And Henry Ford saw that as a way to instill decorum and form. And he did it as a response to his hatred for the jazz and blues music that he was seeing in Detroit, of course, most often played in predominantly Black communities there. And if speaking to many American scholars and individuals in the creation of this book, the idea that they were taught square dancing in school to find out the reasoning behind it being placed in curriculum through Henry Ford's vast connections is troublesome. So moving on here, a connection between the two. On the far right, you see Eddie Wright, another Chatham resident, and in the middle, you see Herb Wakabayashi. And they were 2/3 of a hockey line known as the International Line. And in my book, we talk a lot about this idea of who's Canadian and who's not. But first, I'm going to introduce you to Eddie Wright. Eddie Wright was the first Black NCAA hockey coach. He was the first Black NHL scout with the Anaheim Ducks. and his mother and sisters never saw him play the game of hockey. The reasoning for that is because Eddie knew, and they knew, what kind of slurs would be raining down from the stands. His brother Alan actually saw him play, but Alan ended up getting in fights in the stands, just as the rest of his family knew would probably be the case. But Eddie was a fantastic hockey player, and his closest friends in the whole world were Herb and Mel Wakabayashi. So there's Mel in the middle as the captain of the University of Michigan, and Herb on the right. And the fact that they were called the international line is troubling because Herb, Mel, and Eddie, of course, were all born in Canada. So the only measurement that of their international status was either the last name or skin color. And it's a way of judging again in sport, these nicknames that we give to people of who's Canadian and who's not, and who's included and who's not. And the barriers were always there. Herb and Mel were both All-American All-Stars. They were the best players in the NCAA. Neither one of them got a crack at playing in the NHL. On the far left in this picture is Vicky Sunahara, two-time Olympic gold medalist, seven-time world champion with Canada's women's hockey team. And Vicky's father was a Japanese Canadian who went through internment camps and settled in Blenheim, Ontario, which is where he was raised. The Wakabayashis were both born in internment camps, Mel in British Columbia, Herb in Northern Ontario, and again, following World War II, settled in southwestern Ontario, where large populations of Japanese Canadians landed. Sometimes because after the war, we had 5 Japanese internment work camps here, so populations were already here, but most often it was to work on farms. So the era of Japanese internment, of course, happened following the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And at that time, the Canadian government decided that our own citizens, Japanese Canadians, many who had been here longer than the people making the decisions, their families, were enemies. And immediately, movement rights were taken away. Then property was confiscated, radios, newspapers closed, Japanese language schools closed, and boats, homes, and cars were seized. And the sale of those, this forced dispossession, was used to fund Japanese internment camps. So the rule, of course, was that no Japanese Canadian could be within 100 kilometers of the coast. For the Wakabayashis, that meant that they were sent first into a Japanese internment camp in British Columbia's interior, and then later to work in Northern Ontario. Pictured here is a man named Joe Izumi. And you may know the name Bob Izumi as one of the most famous fishermen, professional anglers in the world. And Joe Izumi lived on Vancouver Island when he was forcefully dispossessed and interned. And through his trips, he ended up working in Rondeau Provincial Park, interned at Eatonville, which is a road camp just outside of the park. Here he fell in love with the bay and fishing. He dreamed of fishing just like he did on Victoria or on Vancouver Island. And after the war, he wanted to raise a family in a space that reminded him of Vancouver Island. So he chose Blenheim, Ontario, just like the Sunaharas, to raise his family. And he started the first ever bass fishing tournament in Canada, all after being, forcefully used as labor during the war. He started, just like most Japanese Canadians, at a place called Hastings Park in Vancouver. And they actually used the former arena of the Vancouver Canucks to place all of the men there before they were shipped off to other internment camps. And thousands slept in the same rooms. The women and children were placed into the livestock barns at that location, which was a fairground. And the livestock barns there were not cleaned. They still smelled like animals and urine. and thousands of individuals were forced to use a single toilet. It was unbearable for most. So there's a picture on the left of the Vancouver Canucks former arena, and on the right is the livestock barns with towels and blankets draped over beds to try to sleep. So the Izumis loved baseball. Joe played, his brother Mitz played, and they played on all Japanese Canadian baseball teams on Vancouver Island. And of course, the Vancouver Asahi are a famous Canadian baseball team in the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame, legendary in this as well. And still not Canadian enough. And that's the title of a chapter in the book as well, because it talks about how we've looked at the skin color and the last names of athletes and deemed them not as Canadian, whether it was the international line or as it became known when Herb Wakabayashi and Eddie Wright made it to university, they were called the United Nations line. And one other story that relates to our Canadian identity here. So Larry Kwong was the first person to actually break the color barrier in the NHL. He did so in 1948, playing one shift for the New York Rangers in the third period of a game, and he never stepped foot on the NHL ice again. But he might not have been the first Chinese Canadian in the NHL had a color barrier not been in place. So pictured here are the Chin brothers, notably George Chin. So in 1944-45, news got out about the Chin brothers from Lucknow, Ontario, and they were known as one of the best hockey lines and groups in the province. So the Toronto Maple Leafs invited them to training camp, and there they excelled. And it was in particular George Chin who excelled. And George never got the opportunity, of course, to play for the Toronto Maple Leafs. But his legacy with the Maple Leafs and in Canadian hockey still lives. Now, tied to our area, he played for the Windsor Spitfires, and he played for the Chatham Maroons. But his time with the Maple Leafs could have been longer. And one person that he influenced greatly was one of the most famous Canadian hockey players of all time, Paul Henderson, who of course scored the 1972 Summit Series goal. Paul Henderson learned to play hockey in the basement of the Chin's family restaurant. On the frozen cement floors in the winter, the Chin family would play hockey and invite neighborhood kids there, one of them being Paul Henderson. The Chin family gave Paul Henderson his first ever set of hockey equipment. And the Chin family coached Paul Henderson all through his minor hockey. Later, of course, Henderson became a longtime star for the Toronto Maple Leafs, the same team that wouldn't take his childhood idol, George Chin. And before I know I've gone through a lot of quick stuff there, but I'm going to read one last excerpt from my book here. And I really want to, or tell you about it, I guess, that one of my neighbors is in this book as well, and he's another Japanese Canadian man named Pat Cosby. And I went to Pat's house, and he showed me these beautiful photos of his mother, whose name was Toki Sugiyama. And Toki was interned at Tashme in British Columbia, and she kept this wonderful scrapbook of all the photos there. And if you looked at them from any other angle, they looked like normal, children. Mixed in with them were pictures of kids playing hockey there. And when Pat came to live just outside of Blenheim as well, he picked up the game of hockey and became the leading scorer of the Blenheim Blades in back-to-back years. And Bob Izumi and his family would eat at Toki's restaurant in Cedar Springs. Bob Izumi's dad was Joe was also a chef who became really great friends with Fergie Jenkins Sr. So everyone's connected in this book, which is a really interesting thing. But Pat gave me these photos, and I carried them home. He didn't want them anymore. He didn't want them in his house. He said when he died, they were going to go in the garbage. And he thought maybe I would find some place where they could have a better home. So they're now in the Nikkei National Museum in British Columbia, and they'll be on display there. And but I carried the weight of those photos with me at home, and I didn't know what to do with them. And I felt this pressure to tell these stories of whether it's Jerry Binga or Pat Cosby or the Chatham Colored All-Stars and Boomer Harding and his son Blake Harding, because I'd interviewed all these people and found out stories that I never knew before. And I hoped, as the book says, that some light can be shined on them, and that we can know more about the history of sports in Canada, because if we don't know the history, we're not going to solve the present issues, where, of course, we see that racist incidents are still happening all the time in sport. And those systems were put in place hundreds of years ago. So the book really travels from the time of colonization in our area. It goes through the Civil War and the settlement of the Elgin settlement and the Don settlement here in Chatham, Kent. It goes through residential schools and Japanese internment. And it travels right up to the present day, where I try to end with a little bit of hope of my daughter playing Little League Baseball in the same field as a young girl named Addie Smith, who's Addie Prince, so Shannon Prince, and from the Buxton Museum there, her granddaughter. And hopefully never having a game called On Account of Darkness again for anyone, because it still is here, and it's still a living part of Canadian history. And I think we've taken this ambivalent approach to it, where we say that we are welcoming and say that this doesn't exist in Canada, it only happens south of the border. But it's false. And if you love sports, I think the book is really going to appeal to you. But if you don't love sports, as you heard through some of my my couple of readings there, it really tries to tell the stories of families and people. And you'll, of course, hear about Jerry Binga's mother and Fergie Jenkins' mother sitting at a table knitting together, and Jerry's mother reading the sports highlights to Fergie's mother, who went blind during childbirth and shortly after. And the people of the book come out, and that's where it all happens, because sports are not inseparable from our world, and they're not this thing that we can keep aside and entertain ourselves with if we're not willing to have the conversations of what barriers are keeping Black youth out of hockey, and are, we're not talking about the reclamation of lacrosse in Indigenous communities. And if we're not talking about the role that sport played in making Japanese Canadians more other than the world around them. So I invite you to hopefully pick it up. You can, of course, buy it at the Amherstburg Freedom Museum. The River Bookshop in Amherstburg also has it. And I've put some other local locations that are there. But right now the book is sitting on the bookshelves of independent bookstores in about 35 to 40 cities across Canada. And I would be thrilled to have anyone reach out to me there at my email address, iankennedywrites@gmail.com, or you can follow me on Instagram or Twitter at iankennedych. And I'd love to have this conversation with you and find solutions for what's coming next, because I've always loved sports and I've always loved stories. And I think that you'll be surprised, as I was with many of these incidents in this book, that the two go hand in hand in creating who we are and where we're at as a society and in sport. And that's where I'm going to end, because I don't want to take up your entire afternoon, and I'm appreciative of the time you've given me. But I want to thank you for joining me. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take those now.
Thank you so much for such a powerful presentation, Ian. I can't wait to read your book. I'm ready to buy a copy from the museum's gift shop, so I will definitely be reading that soon. I do have several questions, so if anyone in the audience has questions as well, you can either raise your hand or put it in the chat section. But while you're thinking of that, I will start asking my questions. So we all know, well, hopefully a lot more people know that Canadians try to brush off or ignore racism and segregation that existed in sport. Do you think that it's more Canadians are trying to protect the integrity of what they think is the sport, or Canada's image as a whole, or both?
I definitely think it's both. I think hockey in particular, there's this right now there's this slogan, hockey is for everyone. And I did a similar talk with the San Jose Sharks of the NHL a few weeks back. And my title there was Hockey is Not for Everyone. Because that's a marketing campaign. It's a slogan that's used to bring in new fans, and it doesn't change the actual culture of the game. So I think we're definitely protecting a sport like that by trying to give it this image. But of course, Canada has this reputation of, we say sorry even when we run into someone, and we're these kind, polite people. But if you look at the history of Canada's history of slavery, of Canada's history of creating residential schools, of Canada forcefully dispossessing and interning Japanese Canadians, it's not our history. Like this idea of us being the all welcoming society is not true. Are we uh, different in many ways and perhaps have less issues on some fronts? Perhaps, yeah. But overall, we're definitely, using any tool we can to promote that um, reputation, false or true.
Would you say it happens that Canadians are most fiercely protective in Canada's game of hockey, or would you say there's another sport that comes close to that?
I mean, in Canada, hockey is everything, right? That is, even though it's not, was never our original sport. It only came into be in the late 1800s. Lots of things were played for many years before that, but hockey has the unique part where um, those barriers were created very early on, whether it was through segregation of arenas and where arenas were placed. I mean, arenas are in suburbs generally. They weren't always right downtown. Maybe there was one initially, but after that, for years, they came with urban sprawl and the cost to enter those sports and this idea that if you don't play hockey, that you're not Canadian enough, or if you don't love hockey. Um, and it's just this idea that it's our game only when hockey in reality is played by like 150 countries in the world. It's a very global game and growing um, in all continents of the world right now. So we definitely fiercely defend that, and you see it through people like Don Cherry who promoted this xenophobic, racist, kind of misogynist tone as Canadians as these tough, rough lumberjacks, but all he was pointing to was uh, Canadians of white European descent, and it's we see it over and over.
Before I ask my next question, we have a comment and I believe a question at the end. It says, "Thank you, Ian. This was a wonderful talk about your book. I'm really eager to read it, and thank you for addressing the myth of Canadian multiculturalism and the myth that Canada is not a white supremacist nation. How to begin changing the various racist systems and institutions that control and fund sports." So I think they're asking, how do we begin to change that?
Yeah, that is a that's the crucial question, of course. Um, I, I I believe all things start with education. And tackling these things at a grassroots level because by the time the athletes have reached the elite levels of junior or professional or whatever Olympic levels, um, the ideology is entrenched, the culture is entrenched, the slang, slurs, and terms that they use are entrenched, and that's one part. Of course, funding being another, where we need programming to introduce sports barrier free to anyone who wants to try them is crucial. And one of the amazing organizations that's doing that across North America right now is called Black Girl Hockey Club. And if you've never checked them out, I strongly recommend you do. They are so incredible, and they're providing scholarships every year to Black women in sport. And one of the things that might not have become fully evident in my presentation there, but we do have multiple chapters in the book that talk about the intersectionality of race and gender and how the history, as you can see, it's predominantly white in general, but then also when you factor in gender, uh, there's far more history out there about Black men and Indigenous men and Japanese Canadian men than there are of women. But the book definitely highlights people like Dolores Shad, who was a wonderful coach and umpire. We look at from Walpole Island, Cheryl Tushkanig, who was a wonderful, the first ever Indigenous woman to play in an LPGA sanctioned golf tournament, and so many others. Alyssa Sands, who's the daughter of Bill, talks about the reclamation of hunting and fishing for Indigenous women, and some of the programming that she's running on Walpole Island First Nation right now. And so it's not to be forgotten or overlooked that there are a number of barriers, but funding, education, of course, and then even as far as legislation, of course, whether it's at the league level, but the rules that we have are not good enough. And one of the things that really bothers me when we see these incidents happening in sport is the language that we used, which I think comes from education, where we talk that it was a racial gesture and not a racist gesture, not a racist action against someone. But we like to, those leagues like to protect themselves by saying it was inappropriate or it was racial rather than calling it out as it was. So having rules where you have clear statements, clear repercussions, educational needs, and of course funding at the grassroots that would be my starting point.
I wanted to ask another question. So you'd mentioned Fergie Jenkins, who I see on the back cover, had written a comment about your book. I was wondering if other athletes who appear in your book have read your book, and what their thoughts have been on the book, including Fergie as well, in addition to what he's written on the cover.
Yeah, just about everybody that was in the book got to read the book. Well, I shouldn't say that. They got to read a part of their section of the book. But Vicky Sunahara has read it, said she couldn't put it down. Bob Azumi, who's up there. Bridget Laquette, who's an Indigenous woman, an Olympian, read the book as well. And the truth for all these people was so important and so empowering to have the words put down there and the stories of their families. And like Ian Jacobs, another one, he was the first Indigenous man ever drafted by an NHL franchise from Walpole Island First Nation. And his story being there is important and powerful to me as well. But yeah, all of the athletes have read it. Some of the bigger names in sport journalism that tackle these topics. You can see there Rick Westhead, who is doing a fabulous job with TSN uncovering abuse in the NHL. Dave Zirin, who's the sports editor of The Nation and also runs a podcast called End of Sport, which if you ever are interested in the intersection of sport and social justice, it's the most amazing, powerful podcast, along with some other scholars that run another podcast called the um, End of Sport. And sorry, his is the Edge of Sport, and then there's the End of Sport. There are multiple similar, but they're all wonderful people that are doing this work. So there's lots of individuals out there, and I think that's what we get lost in sports media is that sport journalism and media often is a promotional tool. It's only showing the good. It's showing the highlights and the goals. But if we want to tackle into how to fix these things that are happening, we need the work to be done exposing the issues that are there as well.
I just had one last question. And again, if anyone in the audience has any further questions, feel free to raise your hand or type it into the comment section. But I was just wondering, you'd mentioned doing some interviews, and I was this is clearly obviously a painful subject, especially for those who experienced it. And I was just wondering if there was points where there was hesitation on the part of the interviewee, to share this history? And if so, how did you make them feel comfortable with sharing their story?
Yeah, so my love for storytelling started at my grandparents' dining room table, and I would sit there and listen to them tell the same stories over and over and over and over and over and over. And I knew them, I thought, off by heart until they passed. And then I lost all the nuance, and that really sparked me to record these. So I spent probably close to 100 hours on Zoom or Google Meets or on the phone or face to face with people talking. And I never approached it with a list of questions per se. I approached it as tell me your story, and then we just talked. And I didn't grill when it got touchy, because of course there were stories of abuse, there were stories of overt racism face to face. One of the most powerful ones that comes to mind is Dorothy Wright Wallace, who of course is integral in the Chatham-Kent Black Historical Society and Black Mecca Museum, telling the story of H.A. Tanzer visiting her grade 3 class and how he stared at her and read the book Little Black Sambo to her and the class while he stared at her. And it was really um, impactful for me. And but for people like Bill Sands, it was part of his healing. He spoke to me about that this telling his story of being at residential school was a history he needed to speak about so that people knew. And so when people were willing to give that information to me to share those moments, yeah, you know, there were tears shed on all sides of the recording devices and tables, and um, but it was just an honest conversation, and I think that's where we learn the most. And if you read the book, you'll find out about my background of coming from a very conservative, racist mindset and being taught every stereotype you could ever learn in sport. And it wasn't until I kind of met people that life changes. And so hearing these stories and allowing people to speak their truth and me just being able to hold that space was the key.
Well, I'm truly grateful for those who were willing to share their stories, even though they were extremely painful. We do have a last comment before we finish up. It says, I wonder if some of the elders who created space for younger generations of athletes have advice on how to survive the eviscerating kinds of racist abuse many athletes endure just to play the game they love. In brackets, they have, I'm thinking of Black hockey players who have bananas thrown at them on the ice.
Yeah. The how to deal with that, of course, I couldn't begin to place myself. Of course, I like to say I come from this place of privilege where um, that's not me, but everyone that I spoke to was empowered by speaking. And I think that's the idea here is that we need to call it out as it is. And that was kind of what was happening. And we're seeing that more now where we're speaking it and we're telling the truth and we're not allowing it to pass. And you'll also read in the book some inspiring stories about allies who have done that. There's one of Jerry Binga's hockey coach in there when he was younger that uh, brought his entire team without Jerry into the dressing room and explained to him some of the racist taunts and stuff that were happening on the ice. And then the team came back out and showed Jerry immense support. And we see those things of that we can all make that difference. So how to deal with it, I don't know. But I think that the rest of us, everybody that's not directly there, needs to call it out and needs to be um, that voice so that if an umpire says we're calling the game on account of darkness, we can all point at the sun and say, no, we're not. Um, and you know, with that togetherness, we can hopefully begin to combat those horrific moments.
Absolutely. We actually have a comment from Jerry Binga, of which thank you so much, Mr. Binga, for joining us. It's an honor. He says, thanks for the discussion of your book. I've only read a portion, but enjoyed the memories. I believe that by writing this book, it is a huge step in a process to advance the narrative that racism has no place in sport or any other facet of life.
Amen.
And actually, we do have another question, if you're okay to answer.
Absolutely, yeah.
Uh, it says, how close do you think the stories you mentioned also parallel the thoughts of general society when it comes to racism? Very good question.
I mean, I think that sport in many ways is representative of general society, and in fact, I think this is a place where we sometimes see those deeper feelings and truths come out. So I think they're identical. I think that um, the issues that I learned in school were the same issues that I learned in sport, were the same issues that I heard at church, were the same issues I heard on the streets. And sports sometimes actually gives us that voice because they're more homogenous of who's playing them, oftentimes in our area, and so it kind of almost emboldens people to do and say those things, or you get the hyper masculine representations of who we are. So I think they're identical, and the book is about 50% uh, of that, talking about the issues, and then it uses sport as a lens to view racism, and it uses sport to show that uh, every area of our society contributes to these barriers and oppression that have been there forever. So it's not isolated outside of any one thing. It's, as we say, it's systemic, right? It's through sport, it's through education, it's through our politics and our government, it's through our religious systems. It's everywhere we look, and we need to combat it from all angles as well.
Okay, so I think we'll end it there. There's no more comments or questions, but again, I wanted to thank you so much, Ian, for being here today to talk about your book. Again, I can't wait to read it. I'm very excited to purchase a copy from the museum's gift shop. And again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us as well. That was a great discussion. This has been recorded, so it will be uploaded to our social media pages, our YouTube and website as well if you did want to share it. So thank you again, everyone. We had a final comment. Thank you so much for the excellent talk and moderation. I can't wait to read it. So thank you again, everyone, and thank you so much, Ian, and can't wait to read the book.
Thanks so
Enjoy the
much.
rest of your afternoon, everyone.